This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I am the co-host, Gilad Halpern. And every week we'll be discussing books and ideas and literature from Israel and elsewhere. Our guests today are anthropologists, two of the three authors of a new book, co-authored together with Sveta Roberman, entitled Mothering, Education and Culture, Russian, Palestinian and Jewish Middle-Class Mothers in Israeli Society. It is being published this summer by Palgrave Macmillan in English, of course. Deborah Golden teaches at the University of Haifa, and Lauren Erdreich teaches at the Levinsky College of Education here in Tel Aviv. Hello to you both and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, Deborah, let's start with you. Why mothering and not parenting? Why the gendered perspective?
Well, I think our perspective is on mothering and education, and we know from research that it's mainly women's work, that bringing up children is mother's work, and certainly education is a very important part of that. So we really, first and foremost, look to mothers.
Mm-hmm. I want to elaborate on that question. I mean, you have so many different angles and groups that you're looking at here. You're looking at Russians in Israel. You're looking at Palestinian citizens of Israel. You're looking at the Israeli middle class. You have the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I don't think I got to the word father until page 21. Maybe I missed it before then. But I'm curious, where is the role of the father here? Let's start with that.
Well, first of all, it was our focus. So we interviewed mothers, we talked to women. We were quite surprised that they themselves didn't bring up the issue of fathers and fathering. And I think that's very much related to their sense of themselves as really the prime movers in their children's education. I was certainly surprised myself by what a really strong sense they have of their own role. And even in this day and age, and even among middle-class women, educated and so on, that they see their role as absolutely vital. They see themselves as irreplaceable in the task of bringing up their children generally and in relation to education.
And that is related to a concept that is central to your analysis, which is intensive mothering. Can you elaborate on that, Lauren?
Sure. I think the idea of intensive mothering, though it's a theoretical concept that we see in the literature that it has origins in the United States. It comes from a bit of research done by an anthropologist in the United States who coined the term really to talk about middle-class mothers. That these are the mothers who have the means, the time, the financial resources, the psychological resources to put their children in the center of their lives. And then mothering becomes this intensive project, which is all their life, all their efforts, and the focus of what they do. And everything else becomes sort of, I don't want to say secondary, but it can contrast a lot. That's the name of the book. And here in Israel, I think we have this idea of the role of moms and the role of mothers and the importance of the Jewish mother, the Palestinian mother. It's tied to a lot of national ideas. It's tied to a lot of our social ideas.
Is it really much more pronounced in a society such as the Israeli?
By compared to the U.S., actually, I'm curious. Because in the U.S. middle class, I'm also surprised at that definition in the sense that in the U.S. in the middle class, most of the time, and actually very often here too, both parents are working. So how is it that the mother, specifically in the middle class, has the time and money and all that stuff to put the child in the center when both she and the husband are probably, or is this an example of the second shift?
That's the problem. She doesn't necessarily. And the question is, what does it do to her? And I think the question is not so much the comparison between Israel and the States. I think the question is what we found in our research is this comparison about the different ways this intensive role gets played out in the different cultural groups in Israel. And that was, and to see how it's tied not only to class and the resources that are available, but also to the conceptions of what a proper mother is within each of these groups, the expectations there are of mothers, the way these mothers relate to the educational system. To give an example, if we look at the Russian mothers and they took on this role. A lot of times the way that they mothered was very much directed by the cultural model that they brought from Russia. This idea that you needed to develop this intensive development, that's what Sveta calls it, using a concept from Russia, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. But that they really took this project of creating the new Soviet man in sort of its Jewish transformation in Israel as a way of getting into the middle class. That was really different than, say, our Palestinian Israeli mothers, the ones that we interviewed, who really worked on developing what we call the well-invested child, which was a child who had access to all resources, everything educational that could make this person the most educated, well-prepared person for leading the Palestinian society. It was a very different project in terms of their middle-class positioning. And
because of that separation between them and the mainstream middle class in Israel that is predominantly Jewish?
Absolutely. The project of mothering became a project that was not only personal but was, had collective implications.
In the sense of advancing a minority, a discriminated minority that is trying to do, better its position in Israeli society.
Yes, they even spoke very often of a child who leads, that we want to develop a child who leads, who's going to be not only get ahead for himself or herself, which is, by the way, something that was across the board, all three of these middle-class groups, they were all very gender equal in terms of how they're raising their children. But here, for
What do you mean
instance,
gender equal? You mean the mothers and fathers were equally involved?
No, in terms of boys and girls.
Oh, in terms of how they treated the children.
How they treated the children, excuse me. Yeah. So the child was not only to be a child who was going to be well-educated for himself and be well-cultured, but he would be somebody who could be an example to Palestinian Israeli society and to Israeli society of what educated Palestinian Israelis were.
So do you think that reflects to some extent the growing participation of Palestinian citizens of Israel in higher education, and specifically women? We know that more than half of the higher education students who are Arab in Israel are women. So does that somehow play into this focus on the mothering role and focus on education?
Yeah, I don't think it plays into it. I think it's it's part of this same sort of the same sort of phenomenon. And I think it's actually the women that we interviewed were women who all participated in higher education, and they were all women who participated in higher education in dominant universities. We're not talking about going to one of the Arab colleges. These are people who had this experience of going into Jewish society, trying to make their own, proving themselves, and their project of mothering, they continued proving themselves and making sure that their children were well invested enough to prove themselves too. So it was this double project.
Okay, so what really, we mentioned the Russian Israelis and we mentioned the Arab Palestinian Israelis, but the mainstream of the Israeli middle class is predominantly Jewish. So they don't really have to invest that much in making a way for themselves or integrating into the mainstream middle class because they're already there. What are the findings that you found about the Jewish group?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, that's why we call our chapter Homing In. It's very much about people, women at home, feeling comfortable. But I think that the sort of project that they're involved in is actually maintaining that sense of security, maintaining that sense of family, intimate relationships between the mother and the children, a community. So I think it's more, I would say that it's more to do with preserving what they already have, if you like.
How does it come about? Can you talk to us about the modalities and practices of that?
Well, they are very, very concerned with the family, with the home, really, with the home, with setting up a home, with being at home, with nurturing relationships between themselves and their children, a sense of intimacy, I would say, and almost to the point of not wanting the outside world to interfere with that, I would say. Sort of setting up a protective space, if you like, for the children. That seemed very much part of what they were trying to do. Mm-hmm. And using other resources like the neighbours, friends and so on to do the same, to be part of that. So I would say it's not adventurous. It's quite inward-looking, if you like.
So the use of the term middle class here can be a bit problematic because we're looking at very different kinds of middle class. What was really the purpose, the conceptual, theoretical purpose of focusing on middle class? Because I would think that also, like working class Jewish mothers would have a similar mothering style to the Palestinian middle class mother in terms of, trying to
advance their position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What can you say about that?
I think it's a good question. I mean, why look at the middle class? And I mean, first of all, I think the middle class is it's a phenomenon and it's worthy of look. Secondly, in terms of mothering, I think, and that's what Lauren said at the start, I think the model of intensive mothering, which comes out of the middle class, then serves as a model for everyone else who's struggling, including working class mums who are somehow not able because they don't have the resources to do it right, if you like.
Where the right, the image of right is sort of set
I'm
by
saying,
that middle
class. Exactly. Another reason why we looked at the middle class is actually we wanted to neutralize the issue of resources, because the idea was that if women have the resources at their fingertips, both in terms of money, time, knowledge, and so on, then possibly issues of social positioning, of culture would surface. So we wanted to neutralize, and we also, the other thing, of course, is we wanted to neutralize class. So we wanted to look at the same class and to see how these different groups are negotiating mothering and education within the same class.
So your parameters for class were predominantly socioeconomic? Is that how you determined your the object of your research?
I think we used a definition of class that is much more what we call in sociology or anthropology, much more emic. It comes from the field itself. In other words, for each of these different groups, the meaning of what it is to be middle class is very different. Basically, in Jewish society, what defines whether you're middle class, for the most part, is financial resources. If you have money, we're talking about salaries, and we're talking also about where you live and home ownership. In Palestinian Israeli society, a big part of what defines you is, of course, is your money, your salary. Home ownership less, though of course to a certain extent. But education is a big factor in this self-definition of middle class. And
in other words, when you correlate, when you ask people how do you define yourselves, and people who define themselves as middle class from those different sectors answer other questions differently. So
Absolutely.
they have different rates of home ownership and different rates of education. That's what you mean?
Yeah, and also with this, with the Russian immigrants, if we had judged them by the same standards as we judged the Jewish women, or I don't want to use the word judge, but if we had set parameters around them, like we set around the Jewish women, we wouldn't be getting these same people who see themselves as coming from a well-positioned middle class. Oh, it's kind of middle class. I don't know if you can say that about communist, the former Soviet Union, but who do see themselves as having some sort of resources, who do see themselves as that's where they should belong.
So how did you define your research group among the Russians?
We had a little bit of difficulty.
Oh,
at
good.
certain
Well,
points.
tell us about your dilemma. That's what's interesting.
We did define them by where they are now. That was one of the big...
Where they are now in terms of income and education and
yes,
where they're living
absolutely,
in the country?
yes. And we are very honest about that. We are not talking about all of the immigrants that came from the former Soviet Union. We are not talking about people who came from certain republics, who came without resources and without education. We're talking about people who came with education, who have managed to get themselves to a certain amount of resources, and that's why we're interested in them, because we're interested in how they deal with this dominant model. We had difficulty less in terms of class, but more in terms of how we wanted to define mainstream mothering. So we said as one of our parameters that we wanted mothers who were in heterosexual relationships.
And
with
in
a partner.
relationships. In other words, you didn't look at single mothers?
We did not, no.
Why not?
It's a relatively small sample. We didn't want to put in all these other sort of factors that could take us into other places, and we wanted to get as close as we could to this dominant model of intensive mothering, which does, relating to your former question, it does predicate itself on the existence of another wage earner in the family. So we wanted to get as close as we could to people who were living the dream, and see what they did with it.
In other words, in their eyes, it's sort of an idealized form of motherhood, of mothering.
In whose eyes?
In the eyes of your subjects, of your research subjects.
I think it's a good question because I think it's something we talked about as well. I mean, this is mainly, although it's ethnographically based in the sense that we have a deep familiarity with these women's lives outside of the interviews, it's mainly interview based. And there's some sense that actually they're talking to us about what they think mothering should be about. We're not sure how much they actually practice what they're saying that they're doing. So I think that's right. It's something to do with their understanding of what their proper mothering should be and should look like.
And how does the traditional element fit into all this? Because middle class suggests, in a way, some sort of, a modern lifestyle that perhaps could take us away from that Jewish mother model that is essentially traditional. How did you address that tension? I mean, how did the concept of tradition of a Jewish mother play out in this a middle class setting?
Well, I mean, let's take the Jewish native-born mothers first. I mean, I think they were...
Jewish mother as a generic title. It applies, of course, to Palestinian mothers as well.
Yeah. And, of course, Palestinian mothers are also native-born.
Yes. Well, that goes back to the issue of what do we call these mothers.
Yeah.
It was difficult to decide exactly how we're going to call these women. And it's. Well, certainly among the Jewish native-born women, I think it, again, fed into the issue of home and making homes. So I don't know whether it was sort of deep-seated... I just don't know whether it was deep-seated religious sentiment, but certainly the traditions were used in order to feed into to this sense of home. But I think different among our Palestinian mums.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for them it was very much a project, like I said before, of making themselves into a different mother than that traditional mother.
What would be the main differences between the traditional Palestinian mother in Israel and the sort of new approach or the intensive mothering on the Palestinian side? What really changes?
First of all, part of their mothering was being an educated woman who has the resource of knowledge. They use knowledge a lot. If we compare them to the other interviews, the other moms, the native Jewish and the Russian immigrants, the Palestinian Israeli mothers were constantly telling us about things that they learned in their higher education or profession, things that they learned in profession. There was a woman who spoke a lot about things she knew about childhood development and how she incorporated it in the home. So it was very much this project of being, the modern science-based mom, which I think is something that they were creating themselves as, something they felt was different. I think it was also their relationship with the educational system. They were very, very involved in the educational system, and they had a lot of knowledge of how the educational system works. And it was interesting because at first we thought it was maybe that we had interviewed women who were involved in the teaching profession or in educational professions.
That was going to be my question.
Right. And then so we said, okay, we got to go check. And so we interviewed some other women, and they also had those same resources, not necessarily because they had it, but because it was in their social network. So they knew about how the educational system worked from their sisters-in-laws or their sisters or all these people that they knew. So that's another factor of this way of being really involved in the educational system.
Which is very interesting. I mean, looking at it from the educational aspect, because in the middle class, education is in a way outsourced. I mean, it goes way beyond the school environment. And that's part of why mothering can be so intensive, because you need to juggle all the extra curricular activity. How did this really play out between the three groups that you looked at?
The way that enrichment activities and private tutors were used was an amazing thing for us to see, because this is actually one of the major concepts in what Annette Leroux calls the concerted cultivation, that the middle class moms really, had this active project of shaping their children as in many ways. And one of the means is this the way they use enrichment activities. And it was very interesting to see how the mothers from the different populations use enrichment activities very differently. First of all, when we asked about education, Palestinian Israeli mothers immediately talked about schooling. we had to ask them about enrichment. So that showed sort of something about priority. The Russian immigrant mothers immediately talked about enrichment activities. For them, that was the real that was the real way to create this multilateral developed personality that's so important in Russian culture.
And what kind of enrichment activities are we talking about?
For the Russian moms or in general?
Well, in general, and because you mentioned that it was such an important part of the Russian moms' experience and discussions, I'm curious what kinds of things they had in mind.
Well, for them, I mean, it's certainly the idea of all sorts of this. You have to get this sort of, I think it was a 4-tiered multilateral development that included aesthetic, cognitive, physical, and moral things. So we're talking about swimming, drawing, sports, music, and also, of course, the major thing, which is this academic side, which the mothers talked a lot about the Mofet system and about using private teachers. And that was really important because they didn't see the educational system as doing it. So their conservative cultivation was very much catered towards that idea of the multilateral developed personality.
Yeah, I'd say, sorry, just to add to that, just I think quite a classical sense of what a properly educated child is, quite a sort of classic. And also language, of course, and Russian language. I think they had private teachers to keep up with Russian language, which was very much important.
Yeah, very much an immigrant experience.
Yes.
But say something about the Jewish moms, because I think that's really important. I think you can only understand it after you've seen or heard about the Palestinian and Israeli moms and the Russian moms. I think then you can only understand the difference in what
I think among the
Jewish
sort of Jewish native-born mums, it was very important. But it was important. First of all, it was very eclectic. There wasn't that sense that we had among the Russian mums that it was very very structured. The women knew exactly what they were trying to find for their children. So among our native-born Jewish women, it was quite eclectic, just all sorts of criteria. And I would say the main issue was sociability. I think that was our main finding in relation. The content didn't really matter. It was more to do with an atmosphere of sociability, convenience.
For the children, what do you mean?
Or the accessibility of the activities.
The accessibility.
Right.
Yeah.
I have another question that I'm really curious about. Israel does differ very much from the U.S. public system in the sense that it's segregated. Right? We have 4 different streams of education between Arabs, religious, secular public, and ultra-Orthodox. Did any of the mothers who were so focused on the issue of education and really seem to take it on in your book as their main task for the children, does anybody look at the influence of this or question or critique it or think that their children are maybe not as enriched as they could be with a more mixed education system? Or is it just a given that this is how children need to be educated?
Well, I think it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we saw I would say among our Palestinian mums, they were the most concerned with preparing their children to function well, to be competent in this very, very complicated environment for their children, so that they would take their kids to shopping malls or whatever, so that they could get used to being to managing, if you like, and coping in a Hebrew-speaking environment and so on. So I think that they were the most concerned with living in what was for them a very, very complicated environment and how to prepare their children to act accordingly. I think, again, among the Jewish native-born mums, they were quite happy within these comfort zones, if you like. I would say among our Russian mums, we had a feeling that they were actually perhaps even preparing their children for the next step on the immigration route. So I think there was even a sense that the children might need to be able to manage in a global world, not only in Israel. I think that was...
And going back to an issue that we discussed in the beginning of this conversation, how do they perceive the role of the father? How different is it?
Maybe I can also add to that question with maybe a slightly more provocative question about your book. In other words, you did say in the beginning that the role of the father didn't just come up that much and you were surprised. But I wonder if writing a book that is focused which is a legitimate decision to focus on the women and motherhood and motherhood, the task of education within motherhood. But doesn't writing a book like that possibly reinforce those roles in itself? In other words, without really questioning it, you accept it, that, it's a traditional role. The mother is the figure in charge of the children and their education, and the man is out there bringing home the bacon, or in this case, the turkey shawarma. Do you think your book might reinforce those roles?
Well, I think it's a good comment. I think that, yes, our social, not specifically, but generally social science work, I think, does that indeed, that we don't just look at a reality and so on. We're actually part and parcel of creating it. I think in this particular book, I think we express in different ways, we're trying to surface how, make explicit, if you like, how taken for granted these women take their roles. And in that sense, I think you could read it as a critique, if you like. So I think it works both ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about my own experience in writing this book. When we started the book, I had one child. I now have 3. And I think as we were writing this book, the attention that we gave to the experience of mothering was incredibly empowering for me. Incredibly empowering for me and for the way I looked at the women around me who are also mothering. And I think that we have to remember this book, it's not a book about family. It's a book about mothers. It's a book, we call it the cultural phenomenology of mothering. It's a book about what mothers experience because of the way that society shapes, directs, offers the opportunities of mothering. So it's a critique, it's a picture, and I think it gets it out there. And then everyone who reads it has to decide what they do with it.
That's a lesson for life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a good way to end this fascinating conversation about the new book, Mothering, Education and Culture, Russian, Palestinian and Jewish middle-class mothers in Israeli society, that was written by Dr. Deborah Golden and Dr. Lauren Erdreich, who are with us here in the studio, as well as Dr. Sveta Roberman. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
And also a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Both of us, that is. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.